Hi everyone, and welcome to this on-demand session for NCEA 2021. My name is Monica Kowalski, and I'm a faculty member for the Alliance for Catholic Education program at the University of Notre Dame. Of course, I wish we could be together in person for this session, but I believe that being virtual does offer some advantages. So you can watch this at your leisure when you have the time and the headspace to fully engage. You can pause and go back as needed during the presentation. You might also enjoy watching this together safely with a friend or a colleague or a school watch party so that you can pause and share ideas with one another to make it more interactive, as it would be if we could be together. In any event, to get the most out of this session today, I do recommend that you have a paper and pen handy, or at least a document open on your computer if you prefer to take notes that way. There will be a few times when I'll ask you to stop and jot some things down. I'm glad you chose to tune into this session, as I do believe it will be relevant and useful for all teachers this year and beyond as we talk about resilient teaching and learning. My objectives for today for this session are to explore some social emotional learning competencies to help build our personal resilience for teachers and to consider ways that this can apply to our students as well. Also, I hope that we'll be able to implement some trauma-informed teaching practices to support all learners in resilient ways as a result of this presentation. Let's begin with a basic definition of resilience. Resilience is commonly considered as the capacity to recover from difficulties and hardships. And I know that every single teacher and student has demonstrated remarkable resilience so far in this challenging school year. Resilience is related to general well-being and human flourishing, and we know that it can be strengthened by a focus on social-emotional learning skills, which we'll explore in just a moment. But before we do, I want to take a moment to reflect on where we are right now. So I was thinking that about a little over a year ago, when COVID began and schools around the world were shut down, it just felt like this big storm cloud rolling in. And there have been some dark, cloudy skies since then that we've had to weather, with remote teaching situations, personal and community health crises, mental health crises, racial and political unrest, you name it. It has been a long, rather dark year. Yet there have been some bright spots, and certainly now I feel like in this picture that we're seeing the sun peeking through the clouds a little bit. We are a hopeful people, and we are ready for the sun. However, we still have some clouds in our sky right now. So I ask you at this point, what are the clouds that you're experiencing? More specifically, what things are you feeling worried or anxious about right now? And I'm going to ask you to actually pause this presentation right now and do a little bit of free writing to list out your worries, fears, concerns, or anxieties, and we'll use that list in just a moment. So please pause and write out the worries and concerns that you have right now. As you come back, I hope that you found it helpful just to list the worries that are on your mind. I know for me, sometimes when I'm feeling pretty anxious, I tend to just fixate on those thoughts. And somehow the act of just writing it down can help get it out on paper instead of keeping circling around in my brain. So just by writing out your worries or journaling in this way, it can be really helpful, but I think it's just the first step. So now I'm going to ask you to go back and read through your list again. And this time, for each item, ask yourself, is this something that I can control? So many of the worries or anxieties that you have may be things that you can control, and others might not be. So when you find a worry on your list that you really have no control over, I want you to just put a little cross next to it as a symbol. Feel free to pause the video again here and take the time to do this now. Okay, I had you put a cross next to the things that you can't control because I want to suggest that those items become a sort of prayer list for you. One of my favorite Bible passages is from Philippians, and it says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God, and the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." In other words, pray about everything, but worry about nothing. This is a quote that I've relied on many times to help me through things. It helps me to recognize those things that are not within my control. It's better to just give those to God and ask Him to help me stop worrying about them. So I suggest that you try to do the same and take those items on your list that you have no control over and just give those to God. Now let's turn to what's left over on your list. After you've given up those things, you might have a few things left that you're worried about that you are at least somewhat in control of. So for those items, I think it can be helpful to think about the actions that you can take to alleviate your worries in that case. So now you can take one item on your list and just think through some action steps that you can take to address that concern. Now, rather than an endless cycle of worry, planning can make you feel productive and empowered to conquer your fears. So again, I invite you to pause and go ahead and think through your list. You can choose one item and then even move to others if you want, depending on how much time you want to take to do this. But just see if it helps you feel a little bit less anxious about those things on your list. Okay, as you return, I hope that was helpful. I know for me, writing out the action steps is another way for me to get that out of my brain and to manage those things that I worry about. So the exercises that we just did in listing our worries and deciding which ones we can control, those are related to some of the 5 core competencies of social emotional learning as defined by the CASEL organization, CASEL. They show this wheel of competencies that's shown here with these 5 different areas: self-management, self-awareness, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making. And we're going to focus on the top 2 there in dark orange. So I think these are probably the most important for building resilience: self-management and self-awareness. So in listing out our worries, we were practicing that awareness, that ability to recognize our emotions and thoughts and how they influence our behavior. And then in deciding how to address them, we were sort of managing our emotions and behaviors in an effective way. You can read more about these competencies at casel.org, and you can learn about ways to grow in each of them and how to teach these to your students as well. But for the purposes of this session today, I just want to highlight that there are links between these SEL skills and building resilience as teachers and for our students. So the activity that we just did with listing our emotions, that was probably helpful for you, but think about how that could also be helpful to do a sort of activity like that with your students. Could they list out things that they're worried about, or are there other ways that you can help promote awareness of students' emotions and thoughts? Here I've identified some of the ways to build resilience overlaid on the SEL competency area. So you see the practicing emotional awareness there by self-awareness, again, that we did, and there's lots of ways that teachers can do this. Some teachers do morning meetings or individual check-ins with students to see how they're feeling. I think it's important in younger grades that teachers work to build students' vocabulary around emotions and help them identify emotions. Older students may find it useful to use journals to express their emotions. There's lots of important practices that teachers can use to help develop that self-awareness in students. Teachers can also do a lot to promote a growth mindset, or the belief that students are capable of learning and improving with appropriate effort. So I put that by self-management because it deals with managing your effort and managing your beliefs about things. Gratitude is also something I included in this model because there's a lot of research in the field of positive psychology that shows that setting grateful intentions at the beginning of the day or the beginning of a class period and ending the day with reflections of gratitude can have a big impact on resilience and overall well-being. And finally, teaching students empathy and perspective taking can help them grow in resilience, as can an optimistic outlook, which can be taught and practiced through attribution training. So when something bad happens, to what do you attribute it to? Pessimists tend to think that bad things are always going to happen, whereas optimists see setbacks as temporary and they are more motivated to try to find ways to overcome them. So you can teach students about this and help them work on building their optimism and gratitude and empathy in all of these areas in order to grow in resilience. I believe that most of you are probably already doing lots of things well in your classrooms that contribute to the development of students' resilience. So I ask you now to pause and take a moment to just self-identify some practices that you're already doing, and also think of other ideas that you might add to your teaching to improve in this area. And if you're watching with someone else, this would be a good time to pause and discuss some ideas together. Okay, I'm sure you've also been told about how important self-care is for resilience and social emotional well-being. It is important, so I'm not going to say that it's not. We want our students to take care of themselves. We want them to get enough sleep and have a healthy breakfast and all of those things. And we know that we should take care of ourselves as well. But it seems disingenuous in some ways to assume that self-care is what's needed when problems are not necessarily your fault and true systemic changes would actually help a lot more. So just as you don't say to someone suffering homelessness that if they just got some exercise and sunshine, they'd be better. Instead, you would try to help them get stable housing to correct their circumstances, right? So it's the same, I think, in this school year that we're dealing with. Um, no amount of sunshine and weightlifting is going to take away a global pandemic and make it easier to teach in that situation. And it is not your fault if you're struggling through this time. I believe this pandemic for teachers and for students has likely been a source of trauma. And that's why we need a trauma-informed approach to teaching and learning to help us be resilient now and in the future as things return to whatever the new normal is going to be in education, and the ramifications of this past year are going to be felt for some time in a lot of ways in education. So let's talk a little bit about trauma. First, I do want to stress that I am not a counselor or a medical expert, and I don't want to trigger anyone's personal experience of trauma in this presentation. We're not going to go deep into what causes trauma or the psychological impacts. I just want to focus more from an educational impact perspective. So trauma can happen at any point in life, but it is particularly troubling for young people. And there's been a lot of research done on what's called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that can have a lasting impact on children, especially with regard to learning, which is what we'll talk about. So some of the sources of trauma include things like systemic racism or oppression, being a victim of or a witness to abuse or domestic violence, living in poverty, substance abuse in the home, parental incarceration, death of a parent, mental illness. And I would add to this list the isolation and disruption from a global pandemic that we are experiencing as well. It's important to understand that not all children or people who experience these sources will have them manifest as traumatic. It's not just the event or the source that matters. Rather, it is how an individual reacts to it that is considered trauma. So we should not assume that someone is dealing with trauma, and we also can't assume that they're not based on what we know about their life circumstances. But rather, identifying possible sources of trauma like this can be useful when viewing a student through a lens of a trauma-informed perspective, especially when we know and understand how a reaction to trauma can impact learning and behaviors. So again, it's the reaction that's important, and we view trauma as a lens to help us understand what students are going through. So on a very real level, a reaction to trauma does impact someone's brain. When we are in a state of toxic stress from severe or recurrent trauma, our brain goes into survival mode. And you may have experienced this, and it's typically a normal and adaptive response to a crisis. When you're in survival mode, the rational part, the thinking part of your brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, it's here in orange, that's the part that normally helps us make wise decisions. But when we're stressed, the lower brain, that limbic system in green, is what takes over, and then we're just kind of acting out of raw emotions and instincts. In survival mode, we often experience the fight, flight, or freeze instinct. And this is commonly understood like if there's a fire in a building. Some people would experience flight and they would just run to the nearest exit. And some would be kind of paralyzed with the fear and they would just sort of freeze. And then other people would jump into action and try to help people, and that's the fight response. These are all appropriate reactions in a fire, but not so much appropriate when you're sitting in a classroom trying to learn. Unfortunately, for students who are experiencing trauma and those adverse childhood experiences, research has shown that their brains actually can be changed and they can get used to always being in survival mode. It can be really hard for them to get back to their more adaptive learning and thinking brain. So what might this look like in a classroom? I like this chart. It shows some of the responses to the fight, flight, or freeze that you might see in your students. So for flight, you might see students kind of withdrawing or skipping class, avoiding, trying to fall asleep in class. That's kind of a flight response. The fight is what we see as typical problematic behaviors in classes, aggressive, acting out, being kind of silly or arguing, hyperactive students, that can be a fight instinct. And then the freeze might be kind of, sitting there with a blank look on their face, being unable to really participate or move, kind of numb to everything. And you may think of students that you've taught that have exhibited some of these characteristics in your class. It might be for other reasons that they're exhibiting that, but it might be because of an experience of trauma. And so trauma-informed teaching tells us to use that as a lens with which to view these behaviors. And I think it can help us have empathy for our students and try to meet them where they are rather than just getting annoyed at the kid falling asleep in class, for example. Importantly, since we don't know and we can't know who has or who has not experienced trauma, it can't hurt to use the trauma-informed approach to teaching for all students. There are some universal ideas for teaching that we can draw upon that will benefit everyone and enable students to overcome challenges in a real safe and supportive type of learning environment. I've condensed some of the research on trauma-informed teaching into a simple approach that I think can be useful for teachers. And I'm going to call it the CARE approach. And it means that we can focus on reaching students who may have experienced trauma by meeting their needs for clarity, autonomy, relationships, and empathy. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time breaking down each of these needs and talking about some strategies that you can implement, whether in person or remote teaching situations. So at this point, I would suggest that maybe you take a piece of paper and divide it somehow into 4 sections so that you can write ideas about each of these 4 components as we go through them. So we'll start with the C for clarity. For children who are experiencing trauma, there might not be a lot of clarity in different parts of their lives. So things can be pretty unpredictable and unstable in their home lives. And in this case, it can really benefit for them to have clear routines and procedures and schedules and expectations in a school or a classroom setting. We could also call this C, consistency, if you like that word better, because it's really important that you provide a consistent, predictable environment for students. What does this look like in practice? I've tried to describe some ways that teachers can meet this need, both in person and in remote teaching. So in person, morning meetings, regular bell work, a normal daily structure, just a caring, consistent adult presence is important. Having consistent rules and boundaries so that students know what's expected of them at all times is really helpful. And if it's possible, if there's going to be some changes happening, like if you know you're going to be out and they're going to have a sub, give students a heads up for things like that so that they know what to expect. In a remote situation, clarity of assignments and scheduling those, clarity of meetings, knowing where to go for things, the location being consistent, and communication is just super important to keep students clear on what's happening in their schools. So now I invite you to pause the presentation and under the C category in your notes, go ahead and jot down some ideas about what you could do to promote more clarity in your teaching in order to reach all students. Okay, we'll move on now to the next area, which is autonomy. Autonomy means the capacity to direct one's own life. It has to do with feeling like you have power and control over what happens to you. Under situations of toxic stress and trauma, children might feel pretty helpless and out of control, like they really don't have control of what's going to happen to them. So meeting this need for autonomy in school helps them feel like they're at least in control of some aspects of their life and their learning. We need to work to make students feel empowered and feel like they have some maybe shared ownership over the learning and the environment in their classroom. In practice, there's a lot of ways that this might look. So in classrooms, I like when teachers will co-construct rules and procedures with students, give them some input into that part of the school day. Assigning classroom jobs is a great way to make students feel like they are empowered and that they have some impact on the classroom. Choices is what we commonly associate with autonomy. So anytime you can give students meaningful choices over what they learn, how they are demonstrating what they've learned, where they sit, what they do. Of course, some choices are limited this year due to COVID protocols, but if there are times when students can choose who to work with or where to go in the classroom, giving those choices can make them feel a sense of autonomy. Cognitive autonomy refers to choices in the way that you think about things, being able to have problems that have multiple answers, and giving students ways to stretch and grow in their thinking can promote that sense of empowerment for learning. And I think service learning is also an opportunity for students to feel empowered, like they're working on a common mission, working for the common good, and making a difference in the world, can really promote that feeling of having some control, having some impact on their environment. In remote teaching situations, students may naturally have more choices of where and how and when they learn, especially in asynchronous situations. But you can also give students autonomy by giving them more responsibilities, like in a Zoom meeting to choose a game or a playlist or to lead a prayer. You can try to build their competence and their sense of agency by explaining to them and giving them power for how to access materials on their own, and to allow them to communicate directly with you and acknowledge that as a strength that they're able to do. And finally, providing rationales and meanings for assignments and for other things that they have to do can help students really buy into things, especially if it's something they're not really excited about doing. Telling them why they're being asked to do it can help them buy in and feel more of a sense of control over that, rather than just like they're forced into doing something. So again, now I'll ask you to pause and reflect on how you meet this need for your students. Okay, moving on, next is the need for relationships. All humans have a basic need to feel a sense of relatedness or connectedness. And in situations where there's trauma, unfortunately, loving and supportive relationships may be lacking in the home for some students. For students, the sense of connectedness, it can also be met if it's not being met at home or in other places in their lives. It can also be met at school through relationships with peers and with their teachers. I think Catholic schools are generally really, really good at meeting this need for relationships with students, because we tend to focus a lot on building strong classroom communities. We lean on our faith and our beliefs and the importance of community. If you think about it, God himself is community in the Trinity. And so we strive to replicate that in our Catholic schools and live with and for each other. I like this quote from Mother Teresa that says, "We've just forgotten that we belong to each other." And I think in Catholic schools, it's our job as teachers to remind students that we do belong to each other, and to ensure that every student feels like they belong in our classrooms. And like I said, I know Catholic schools are generally awesome at this, but this year's made it even more challenging. Maybe you can't rely on some of the ways that you typically build relationships with your students. You can't give hugs or other physical touch. Sometimes you can't even show a smile to students when you're wearing a mask this year. So it's been challenging to develop those relationships. Nevertheless, I think there's lots of ways that teachers are building relationships with students this year, in person and remote. So I wanted to just mention some of these. Icebreakers or other games that you play with students in either situation is always fun. Getting to know you activities at the beginning of the year, perhaps, or even throughout the year, having things like a star of the week to recognize individuals and get to know students, celebrating students' birthdays with special messages. Things like that can really go a long way. Collaboration is a great way to build relationships, to have them work together in different ways. And cultural representation is also super important to make students feel known and seen when they see images and examples that look like them and make them feel valued and as though they belong in the classroom, regardless of the color of their skin or the background that they bring to the classroom. In remote situations, you can do a lot of the same things that you can in person. If students are learning asynchronously, having videos is good so that they still see you and feel connected to you. If you are doing meetings or having small group or individual meetings with students, that's a great way to continue those relationships. And I encourage you to also think about ways to vary participation structures in remote situations. There's lots of kids that just don't feel comfortable speaking out on camera during a Zoom meeting, for example, but maybe they'd be okay to participate by using the chat function or collaborating on a Google Doc to participate and share their thoughts in writing rather than speaking. So thinking of ways like that to involve all students is really important, regardless of what format you're teaching in. So let's take a moment again to pause and jot down your ideas for meeting the needs for relationships in students. Okay, finally, the E in CARE stands for empathy. Children experiencing trauma need to know that someone cares and understands where they are. If you keep trauma as a lens, then you can consider what they may be going through and how you can use that knowledge to offer support to them. We can give grace for students when they struggle academically, behaviorally, or otherwise. And we can teach them about growth mindset, how to keep trying and learning from their mistakes and challenges. Also, I think it's important to recognize that we may not be able to solve all their problems, and we want to be mindful of other resources that may be available, such as referrals for counselors or other mental health or even child protection service providers whenever that's necessary. Empathy in the classroom may look like a lot of things. It may look like teaching all students directly and explicitly about empathy and other social emotional learning skills. So they don't need to only receive empathy from the teachers. They should be encouraged to show empathy to each other as well. They can meet that need in different ways. We can differentiate our supports for students. That's a way of showing empathy in honoring what the individual students need, not just giving every child the same thing. We can respond to behavior issues with empathy in considering the root causes for the behavior, not just looking to give consequences all the time, but thinking about why is this happening and what skills are lacking? What can I teach this child to help them develop the coping skills they need so that they don't continue this type of behavior? We can also show empathy by normalizing mistakes, again, with growth mindset, helping students realize that it's okay to make mistakes, that's human, and that's how we learn, and that's how we grow. So we normalize that and help them see that that's an okay thing to happen in the classroom. In remote teaching, first of all, I just encourage you to recognize that learning at home is a unique challenge. I know it's hard for you as teachers to teach students remote, but it's hard for them too. So we can empathize with them when they express that it's challenging or that they don't enjoy it or that they wish they were back at school. Just affirming those feelings and helping them work through them. We can help them fight the overwhelmingness of online learning by prioritizing assignments, telling them which things to really focus on, providing time limits and guidelines. You know, if you're in class, you usually tell students when to stop something, but online, they don't always have that knowledge to know when to stop working. So telling them this should take you about 20 minutes or so is good practice so that they know to stop after if it's getting too much longer than that. Also just making connections, holding office hours, having Q&A time, realizing that they may have more questions and need more support. And I think it's important, especially in remote teaching, to check in with parents often, to ask for feedback, and to empathize with what they're going through as well. So one last time, I invite you to pause and reflect on how you accomplish meeting the need for empathy for your students. Okay, now just before we close, I want to emphasize a few key takeaways from this session. We started with an SEL exercise of identifying our worries and deciding which ones we can and cannot control, and I encouraged you to try to remember to worry about nothing and pray about everything. We also practiced just naming those concerns and doing action planning to help take away some of those emotions, and that's a form of self-management. We talked about how self-care is important but not sufficient for teachers, especially this year, and that lots of people are experiencing trauma this year. We talked about how trauma can be experienced differently by different individuals. It's a reaction, not the experience itself, and that we can use the lens of trauma to help us understand what's going on with our students. We talked about how trauma can impact the brain and how we can teach in a way to meet the needs for our students through that CARE method of clarity, autonomy, relationships, and empathy for all of our students. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this session and that you took some valuable information to help you remain resilient in challenging teaching times and to reach all of your students. If you have any feedback or questions, please reach out to me. My email is kowalski.42@nd.edu, and you can follow me on Twitter at Monica J. Kowalski. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for your work in Catholic education, and may God bless you all in the remainder of this school year.